All right, thanks for joining. We are looking at the deity of Christ in the Gospel of Mark this evening. And the reason we're doing that is I often think that Mark is the cheapest gospel. It's the shortest, seems really fast-paced, he's not interested in the details, but really Mark presents, I think, one of the most compelling portraits of Jesus as Yahweh. And a couple background comments. Historically, the church has attested that Mark's gospel is actually Peter's preaching. Mark was recording Peter as he preached in Rome. And I think there's some compelling parallels if you read Peter's sermons in Acts and the Gospel of Mark, or if you read 1 Peter and the Gospel of Mark, you'll see very much the same concepts, themes, ideas. I think there's a good reason to believe that. Also, when you read Mark, you'll notice the first verse says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Some scholars actually don't think that this is the first line of the gospel. It's actually the title. And one of the reasons I think that's compelling is because Mark is actually giving us the structure of his gospel here. Mark has two big reveals he's going to make in his gospel. If you look over on the right side of the screen, you will see here we have Mark 8, verse 29, and through the first half of Mark's gospel, his disciples are incredibly hard-hearted. They don't seem to understand who Jesus is until finally Jesus says to him, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." So the first thing Mark is going to tell us in verse 1 is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The second big reveal doesn't come until the very end of Mark's gospel. You'll see it on the right, Mark 15, verse 39. The centurion, as Jesus died on the cross, stood facing him, saw that in this way he breathed his last. He said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." Well, what is verse 1 telling us? The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So there's compelling reasons, I think, to believe verse 1 is the title, but it most certainly is the structure. Mark is going to reveal that Jesus is Israel's Messiah, and Jesus is the Psalm 2 beloved Son. But being that verse 1 is the title, verse 2 is really what opens Peter's argument. And he starts by mentioning the prophet Isaiah, but interestingly, he doesn't quote Isaiah until verse 3. Verse 2 is actually from Malachi chapter 3. And often we hear the promise of the coming messenger as a great thing. It's a sign that God is going to come save his people. But this quote in verse 2, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way," is from Malachi 3, verse 1, which is a judgment warning. Malachi is preaching that Yahweh is going to come. You see it down in verse 5 here. Sorry, I covered that up. But Yahweh is going to draw near to Israel for judgment. And of course, one of the main things that Mark points out, and one of the main things that the other gospel writers point out, is that when Jesus enters into Yahweh's temple, he then overthrows the exchangers, right? And he calls it, Jeremiah, he uses his words, that the temple has become a den of robbers. Israel during Jesus' day is just as offensive as it was in Jeremiah's day. And so Mark opens with this promise that God is going to send his messenger. But the person who's going to follow the messenger in Malachi 3 is Yahweh, says the Lord of hosts. Malachi 3, verse 5, it is Yahweh doing the talking. Yahweh himself is going to visit the temple. And so John the Baptist comes on the scene in Mark, and then eventually Jesus himself walks into the temple. And of course, the temple overthrow is sandwiched in between the judgment of the fig tree, because Jesus himself is judging the temple. And so Mark opens with Malachi 3. This is a great reminder. Yahweh is going to come judge the temple. And what happens? Well, Jesus comes and judges the temple as Yahweh said he would. And now, this is a mixed quote, so it has Malachi 3, but it also has, in verse 3, Isaiah 40. And you see Isaiah 43 over here on the right, 40, verse 3. It reads, "A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord." This is Yahweh as well here. "Make straight in the desert a highway for our God." Now, Isaiah 40 is a great promise of salvation. And so this mixed quote is taking these two great warnings or prophecies, one from Malachi and one from Isaiah, and both of them are mentioning a messenger who will precede the arrival of God himself. Malachi warns that arrival will come with a judgment of the wicked, and Isaiah promises that God's arrival will come with salvation. And so Mark opens his gospel with this mixed citation, reminding Israel, Yahweh himself said he would come. And before Jesus comes onto the scene, he reminds us that Yahweh is going to arrive. Yahweh would come judge his temple. Yahweh will come save his people. And who comes up next? Well, Jesus himself. Mark is presenting to us that Jesus is Yahweh, come to judge his people and to save all those who would trust in him.